Chapter 20 Farting in Hirohito. At first, there was silence and isolation. At night, no one spoke. Come daylight, Louis was suddenly in a crowd, hustled outside, and herded in crazy circles, but with eyes obediently down, mouth obediently closed. He was no less alone. The only break in the gloom came from a guard who would saunter down the barrack aisles, pause before each cell, raise one leg, and fart at each captive. He never quite succeeded in farting his way down the entire cell block. In stolen glances, nods, and hushed words, Louis sorted out Afuna. Most men in the barracks were Americans, survivors of sunken ships or crashed planes. Down the hall lived an American Navy officer, Commander John Fitzgerald, captured after he scuttled his burning submarine. The Japanese had tried to torture information out of Fitzgerald, clubbing him, jamming knives under his fingernails, tearing his fingernails off, and pouring up his nose until he passed out. Fitzgerald had never broken, and as one of the highest ranking captives, did his best to protect the men. During forced exercises, Louis fell into step with a young Marine named William Harris. Captured in the Philippines in 1942, Harris had escaped diving into Manila Bay and embarking on an 8.5 hour swim. Wading ashore on the Japanese occupied Bataan Peninsula, he hiked through jungles and over mountains, sailed in borrowed boats, and hitched rides on burros, surviving in part by eating ants. He'd nearly made it to Australia by boat when civilians turned him in to the Japanese. Each day, Louis and Harris hung together, laboring through forced exercise, bearing the guards' blows and whispering. The curious thing about Harris was that while he was tall, 6'2" or 3, virtually everyone, including Louis, would remember him as a giant as tall as 6'10". In a sense, Louis and the others were right. Harris was a genius, highly educated, conversant in several languages. He had a perfect photographic memory. A captive once found him with hands parted as if holding a book. Asked what he was doing, Harris said he was reading a text he'd studied in school. If Afuna was astounding memory, would be a blessing and a terrible curse. Afuna had one other notable resident. Gaga was a duck who limped around on a broken leg that a captive had fitted with a splint. Everywhere the captives went, Gaga peg-legged with them. A captive will later swear that when the men bowed toward the emperor, Gaga bowed in imitation. In so dark a place, this cheerful bird became especially beloved. Louis rarely saw Phil, who was housed down the hall. The pilot was frail, his eyes haunted. Once, when Louis shuffled up next to him outside, Phil finally spoke of the crash. He said he felt responsible for his men's deaths. Louis tried to reassure him that the crash wasn't his fault. Phil was unswayed. I'll never fly again, he said. As Louis adjusted to Afuna, he noticed something strange. Every other captive was relentlessly interrogated, but he was never questioned. Clearly, the Japanese had no interest in what he knew. They had some reason for subjecting him to the misery of Afuna, but he had no idea what it was. Soon Louis discovered that Afuna's submissive silence was an illusion. Beneath the hush was a humming underground of defiance. It began with sidelong whispers. Men scribbled notes on toilet paper and hid them for each other in the bingo. Exploiting the silent rules loophole, captives were permitted to speak to guards. They'd approach the guards in groups and speak English using a querying tone. The confused guards thought they were being asked questions, but the men were really speaking to each other. At night, if the guards stepped away from the cells, the whole barracks would start tapping out Morse code. Outside in daytime, Louis and the others whispered in code. Tit for dot and da for dash. Words could be spoken without moving the lips. Others hid their hands and gestured. A fist was a dot, a flat hand was a dash. Because guards who caught captives speaking about them often responded with savage beatings, the men gave them nicknames including Turd Bird, Flange Face, the Weasel, Liver Lip, and Termite. One guard was especially feared. He was the medical officer, a sadist who tortured and beat captives for pleasure. A massive man, he punched like a heavyweight. They called him the Quack. The defiance took on a life of its own. Men smiled and addressed guards in friendly tones, cooing out filthy insults. One captive convinced a particularly daft guard that a sundial would work at night if he used a match. A favorite pastime involved saving up intestinal gases, explosively abundant thanks to dysentery, before roll call. Ordered to bow down Emperor Hirohito, the captives would pitch forward and fart in unison. Louis had another private act of rebellion. A captive gave him a tiny book he'd made from rice paste flattened into pages. On the central pages, Louis made it seem a harmless address book. In faint script upside down in the back, he kept a diary, forbidden at Ofuna. He hid the diary under a loose board in his cell. With daily cell inspections, discovery was likely, and he would surely bring a clubbing. But the diary was precious to Louis. He knew he might die here. He wanted to leave a record of what he had endured and who he had been. After food, what the men wanted most was war news. The Japanese sealed the camps for more information and told captives preposterous stories of Allied losses, even announcing that their military had shot Abraham Lincoln and torpedoed Washington, D.C. They couldn't understand why they laughed, said a prisoner. Afuna officials had no idea the captives were following the war in spite of them. New captives were questioned by fellow captives. The news tapping through camp in minutes. The Japanese rarely brought newspapers in, but when they did, stealing it was a camp-wide obsession. Stolen papers were passed to Harris and Fitzgerald, who spoke Japanese. As translations were done, lookouts stood by. When guards neared, the papers vanished, soon to be put to their final use. In a camp with a lot of diarrhea, a little toilet paper, newspapers were priceless. Knowing the Allies were winning was immensely inspiring, enabling men to hang on a little longer. But that wasn't the only benefit of stealing and defiance. Through acts of resistance, dignity was preserved, and through dignity, life itself. Everyone knew what the consequences would be if anyone was caught stealing papers. At the time, it seemed worth the risk. In the fall, snow came, gliding through the gaps in the barrack walls. Wearing the summer clothes he'd crashed in, Louis shivered. Shut outside all day, he and the others huddled, mixing slowly to give each man in the warmer middle. The rations dwindled. Unloading ration trucks, captives saw nutritious fare, but it was never served to them because the Japanese were stealing it. The most flagrant cheat thief was the cook, who packed the food on his bicycle and pedaled off to sell it. He reportedly bought a furnished house with his profits. The stealing left Afuna in famine. Most captives were emaciated, but Louis was the thinnest. The rations weren't nearly enough, and he was plagued by diarrhea. He teetered through the forced exercise. Once he collapsed, sprawled on the floor, he heard laughter. Learning that Louis was a former Olympian, the guards brought in a Japanese runner for a match race. Forced to run, Louis was trounced, and the guards mocked him. He was angry and shaken, and his growing weakness scared him. Prisoners were dying by the thousands in Japan's camps, and winter was coming. Captives stepped in to save Louis. A Norwegian gave him a coat, and each day, at enormous risk to themselves, the captive kitchen workers snuck him an extra handful of food, which Louis split with Phil. Grateful, Louis hung on. At the end of 1943, the captives had a taste of liberation. Veteran captives, Louis included, were allowed to speak outside. When new captives arrived, they were whisked into solitary confinement until initial interrogation was over. In early 1944, Louis was tracked down by a new captive just out of solitary. He was an amputee, one leg gone. His name was Fred Garrett, and he'd been a B 24 pilot. Amazed to see Louis, he told a remarkable story. In December, America had bombed Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands. Garrett was shot down, incurring a gaping ankle fracture. Captured, he was thrown into a cell block with 19 other Americans. His ankle became severely infected, maggots hatched in it, and Garrett began running a high fever. He was told he'd be given medical care only if he divulged military secrets. If not, he'd be killed. Garrett lied in the interrogation, and the Japanese knew it. Garrett was tied down, given a spinal aesthetic, and forced to watch as Japanese corpsmen sawed off his leg. Though the infection was limited to the ankle, the corpsmen cut Garrett's entire leg off so he could never fly a plane again. Delirious, Garrett was shipped to Afuna with two other captives. The 17 Americans left behind were never seen again. As he lay in agony in his cell, Garrett had seen 10 names scratched into the wall. He was told the first 9 had been executed. No one told him the fate of the 10th man. Garrett had long thought about the last man. When he'd arrived at Afuna, he asked if anyone knew that man. His name was Louis Zamperini. Garrett and Louis, both Los Angeles area natives, had been imprisoned in the same tiny quadrillion cell almost 5,000 miles from home. Plodding around the compound that winter, Louis and Harris befriended Frank Tinker, a pilot who'd been brought to Kwajalein with Garrett. The three stuck together, distracting each other from the cold with mind exercises. Louis strengthened his legs, lifting his knees high as he walked. The guards began goading him into running. In spring, the guards brought in another Japanese runner and ordered Louis to race him, warning that if he refused, all captives could be punished. Louis lagged behind with no intention of winning, but his body was so light that running was surprisingly easy. He saw captives watching him, breathless. As the finish approached, they started cheering. Louis knew what would happen if he won, but the cheering aroused his defiance. He lengthened his stride, seized the lead, and crossed the line. The captives whooped. Louis didn't see the guards' club coming at his skull. He just felt the world tip and go away. His eyes opened to the side of the sky, ringed in his friends' faces. It had been worth it. In March, Phil was taken away, bound for what officials called a plush POW camp. He and Louis had a brief goodbye. They spoke of finding each other again someday when the war was over. Phil was led away. Phil's new camp, Ashio, was far from plush. Ashio's POWs were enslaved in a copper mine in horrendous conditions. But there, Phil was told he could write home. He hadn't seen Cece or his family in well over 2 years and knew they'd probably thought he was dead. He wrote about the raft, his capture, and yearning for home. The first night home will hear some interesting tales, he wrote. Much love till we're together again. The Japanese never mailed his letter. It was found in the garbage, partially burned. Phil reclaimed it. If he lived through the war, he'd deliver it in person.